Even if we shut off all emissions today, there is a lag in warming because we will continue to warm, for another 15, 20 years. So even when we turn off all emissions, that carbon train has a lot of inertia behind it. Last year in 2023, China brought on more renewables than pretty much all of the world combined. So when, yes, there is a lot of criticism to be had for, China continuing to build out new coal plants, but I should always remind the listeners that the United States is the largest emitter over time.
Hi, I'm your host, Brent, and welcome to The Climate Guru, where we discuss pressing environmental issues, including with leading experts. Join us for insightful conversations to inform and inspire action in your everyday life. We are very, very fortunate to have Adrian Gallo with the Idaho Conservation League as a special guest today. How you doing, Adrian?
Doing great.
Okay, good. Well, thanks for inviting us in, and we're going to talk, I understand, about climate change, and I guess global, regional, Northwest, and Idaho. So tell me what projects you've been involved in, studies, and what are your objectives?
In my previous decade of life, I was researching climate, especially how ecosystems are responding to a changing climate. And my research sites spanned across North America, everywhere from the wetlands of Florida to the desert Southwest and the permafrost areas in northern Alaska.
Wow.
And pretty much everywhere I looked, the outlook was not great. And I was not happy just publishing papers behind academic paywalls saying that climate change is bad and we should do something about it. And I really wanted to be part of the solution. So that's what brought me here to the Idaho Conservation League as the climate program manager to start working on a lot of these issues.
Wonderful. Let's look at the big picture. And of course, I think it was 1988 that there was a presentation to Congress that I think it was James Hansen that said, from NASA, that said, hey, members of Congress, the Earth is warming and it's from greenhouse gases, carbon, methane, and the other minor ones. We've known this maybe for 100 years from other scientists, but this is the reality. And then we began with many of the Intergovernmental Panel and the COP meetings. And so as that's all evolved, and for example, the carbon budget is being used up, the amount of carbon that we can emit into the atmosphere to reach certain goals, 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.5 degrees Celsius, things that I see and I read seem pessimistic. In other words, the nationally determined contributions and things like that countries promise to make. I mean, since the Paris Agreement in 2015, there's no requirement that countries comply with their promises to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, the promises made, which aren't even being kept, I understand, if those were met, we'd still exceed those goals and certain tipping points. So what gives you optimism?
There's two graphs that come to mind. One is, global temperature increasing as CO2 concentrations increase. And the predictions in 1990 are almost exactly in line with what we have today, 420 parts per million, and, an equivalent warming of, 1.3 or 4 degrees Celsius. They got that almost exactly right in 1990. There's a second graph that they got exactly wrong. There was no international agreement on stopping the release of these ozone-depleting chemicals. And that was about the only thing that those scientists in 1990 got wrong, because they were not expecting that a large international agreement would have taken place, but it actually did. My sister is a science teacher in middle school, and she doesn't even teach the hole in the ozone layer because we more or less fixed it.
But we still have, in pre-industrial times, 280 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. Now we have over 450. And if you look at the graphs of carbon, it matches temperature rise exactly on these charts, on these graphs. So if carbon's increasing and methane is increasing and nitrous oxide, I guess those are the three big greenhouse gases, why, with the reduction of chlorofluorocarbon, are you optimistic?
The chlorofluorocarbons were just really good at making a hole in the ozone layer. So because we are phasing those out, they're almost completely gone, but the hole in the ozone layer itself is closed. And if that would have remained open, it would have resulted in 1.2 degrees Celsius of warming just by itself. And then, of course, CO2 coming from the burning of fossil fuel. All of those Depending on what country you're in developed countries, they have been decreasing their emissions of those. In the United States, we peaked our emissions in 2005, largely due to the transition from coal to natural gas. And in developing countries, they are still increasing their emissions. So some countries that are further along this curve have been decreasing their emissions for a long time. Other countries that are still developing are continuing to increase their emissions.
So developing countries may be even using coal-powered generating plants, which of course is the filthiest of the fossil fuels. And if we shut off all greenhouse gas emissions today, we still have carbon, and we still be facing issues with tipping points. Am I right? So considering that and the best promise we've had from China is, well, we're going to start to reduce it in 5 or 10 years with all the coal plants they're not only building in China, but I guess in Southeast Asia where they're doing business. So in light of all that, what gives you optimism?
The carbon dioxide stays around the atmosphere for at least 300 years. Methane, about 25 years. So even when we turn off all emissions, that carbon train has a lot of inertia behind it. The oceans absorb most of the heat and most of the CO2.
90% of heat and 30% of the carbon.
Mm-hmm. The effects that we see on the landscape, like the physical land, the terrestrial land, is secondary to the effects that are happening in the ocean. So what gives me hope? In the last 5 years or so, countries across the world in earnest, developed countries mostly, because they have the financial capital to do so, they have made honest strides to start buying and producing more renewable energy. China makes and produces 90% of all of the solar panels. China has ramped up their production of renewables to unbelievable amounts, such that their plans for building out coal power plants are now decreasing because they're producing so much renewable energy products that they're using the excess for themselves. And this is an exciting development, again, that actually makes me hopeful. There is a report released by, I believe it was Carbon Plan, that looked at the economic and financial and China's economy, really. And they're expecting that this year, 2024, will likely be China's peak emissions.
Wow. For
a number of reasons. Their economy is slowing down for a number of reasons, but the combination of their economy slowing down and the fact that their one main, very strong driver of the economy that is increasing are renewables production. Last year in 2023, China brought on more renewables than pretty much all of the world combined.
Wow.
So when, yes, there is a lot of criticism to be had for, China continuing to build out new coal plants, but I should always remind the listeners that the United States is the largest emitter over time. So
right. Historically, we're it. And I guess industrial Europe is number 2. And we put out the most filthy emissions since the Industrial Revolution, which we and I guess Western Europe led. And now we're number 2 in the world in emissions after China and just ahead of India. So you are optimistic. And in the developing world, I know those countries are saying, hey, look, we contributed almost nothing or nothing to the amount of carbon in the atmosphere and the other greenhouse gases. So what are you blaming us for? We have to develop. We need to develop our economy with industry and electricity. And if we're going to build them out of coal plants, leave us alone. But they are a very small amount of emissions today. And are there the promises that I hear in the international community to help fund developing countries to go into renewables? How is that going on?
There are lots of promises. Very few of them are kept.
Right.
The developing countries have emitted historically a rounding error worth of emissions. The difference between 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming and 1.6 degrees Celsius of warming means that dozens of Pacific Island nations will no longer be inhabitable because the storms are just too great that they can't maintain their infrastructure. There is no just transition because we started this transition today. And if we would have started in the 1990s or the early 2000s, maybe we could have had a real just transition. But that is not a reality that we have because we're going to blow past 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming.
There's some scientists who say we've reached it.
So 2023, the best estimates is that we experienced 1.4 degrees Celsius of warming. So when we hit 1.5 degrees Celsius, that doesn't mean, snap of a finger, all tipping points, transition.
Right. And so the hope is we won't reach 2 degrees, which was the original IPCC limit and goal until they came out with that special report that said, no, We think it's 1.5 degrees, which we should really target ourselves towards. In light of the carbon budget, the amount of carbon that the world can emit into the atmosphere to maintain certain temperature goals, so whether it's 1.5 degrees Celsius increase over pre-industrial times or 2 degrees, how much is left in the carbon budget, and how much are we putting out a year globally?
Not much is left in the carbon budget. If we are to remain at, and this is globally, if we are to remain at 2020 emissions levels, we have 7 years left before we emit the amount of carbon that will kind of lock in 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. I am not optimistic that we can do that. No serious person believes that we can transition fast enough to hold to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We have about 30 years left of 2020 emissions to stay below 2 degrees Celsius of warming. And I'm highly optimistic that we can do that. Now, the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius is magnificent.
So you believe that with current trends, we'll probably blow past the 1.5 degrees, although it's based on multi-year trends. We don't know now that it's, even though we've had temperatures above 1.5 degrees last year, for example, you believe we can stay below 2 degrees Celsius and remain there in light of trends that are going on in China, as you mentioned, Europe, the United States. So that's your optimistic view.
And, this is it's an optimistic view that we're not getting to 2.5 degrees Celsius. And a 2 degree warm future is awful. It is truly, truly scary. I don't need to read science fiction. I read the IPCC reports. But the difference between 2 and 2.5 is a different universe of negative impacts.
Yes. I've read that if we continue on our present business as usual, the 22nd century will be the century from hell in terms of global warming, loss of agricultural production, sea level rise, millions of people migrating out of desperation. But we can have a difficult time as our century goes forward, and a difficult time the next century, but it won't be unbearable, horrible. It won't be the century from hell. So you're saying that if we keep below 2 degrees Celsius, these are manageable conditions as a result of climate change, perhaps?
A 2 degrees Celsius world is where we start getting into breaching some tipping points that we can't surpass. What keeps me up at night is knowing what I know about the permafrost in Alaska and all of Russia. Permafrost, for those who don't know, are permanently frozen lands. It's about 50% carbon. And they are no longer permanently frozen because they're beginning to warm. Once they warm, it's about 50% carbon, 50% water, these soils. And once that water leaves from solid and into a liquid, then that organic matter that is about half carbon begins to release into the atmosphere. Then it releases greenhouse gases, which then warm the planet more, which then causes more permafrost thaw. That is a tipping point that once it starts in earnest, you can't really stop it. And that would probably be surpassed at around 2 degrees Celsius.
Okay. So tipping points, of course, are natural conditions that are affected by climate change. And then when a certain change occurs, whether it's the permafrost in the Arctic area or all around the world, or whether it's melting of Antarctica or other, where there's a tipping point where it becomes irreversible. In albedo, for example, why don't you explain what albedo is and how it affects a tipping point in terms of glaciers and also Antarctica?
Albedo is an idea that when you have white glaciers or white snow, that literal white color will reflect the heat back to the atmosphere. And there's actually been some research showing that when there are wildfires nearby, the little pieces of black soot that get on the snow or on the ice, they accelerate the warming and they accelerate ice melt.
Now, because of absorption of heat because of their color.
Literally because of their color.
Because of their color. They absorb heat as opposed to reflect heat, which ice does. So as ice melts, there's less ice, there's less reflective surface, and so the Earth is heating because it's not reflecting heat, and it's a cycle that becomes irreversible. That's what scientists say, right?
Correct.
Mm-hmm. And so we haven't reached tipping points with the Arctic or Greenland or other major ice bodies, although we're concerned about their melting. And presently, your biggest concern is the permafrost, which stores vast amounts of carbon and also methane. Am I right?
And also methane. To put some numbers on it, permafrost by itself contains about as much carbon as what is contained in the atmosphere and all above ground biomass combined.
Wow. It's amazing, and because there's no oxygen, it doesn't break down in the frozen soil. Am I right?
Correct. It's that there's no oxygen because it's both frozen and it's solid in ice, so that prevents the decomposition of this material.
So you're up at night thinking about the permafrost as well as people like me. So we've talked about China. What trends are happening in Europe and the United States and the industrial world? We can throw in, I guess, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. What's happening in the industrial world that gives you encouragement about us staying within the carbon budget and remaining below an increase of 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures?
What gives me hope, we'll return to an example from 2005. The transition from coal to gas was a combination of two things. Economic viability of fracked natural gas became much easier and cheaper to access compared to coal. And at least in the United States, the Clean Air Act got a few more sharper teeth. So the combination of those two made the coal to gas transition rather quick. It's not completely over with, but whether or not people who worked in coal jobs like to admit it, it was natural gas that basically killed off the coal industry.
Right.
And today, an almost similar thing is happening with gas to renewables. Across the world, there are many more financial incentives for utilities and companies to use renewables, wind and solar, for example, compared to continuing to do business as usual. So even Meta, Facebook of the world, the Googles of the world, they're even beginning to procure most of their electricity from renewable resources. And that simply was not the case 5 years ago. If you would have interviewed me 5 years ago, I would have been far more pessimistic today. But what gives me hope is the capitalistic incentives of our system across the world are now aligning with the need to switch to renewables. Now, I wish that would have happened 30 years ago, but this is the stage that we're at today. And once that capitalistic engine really runs, it runs quickly.
The cost of producing a kilowatt of electricity with wind or solar compared to coal or natural gas, which most of the coal plants are being converted to, is much lower. I mean, the cost of renewables has dropped precipitously over the last few years, hasn't it?
Yes. So again, if you would have asked me 5 years ago, the cost was about similar for, a kilowatt of energy from gas compared to solar. But today, it is significantly different. So it costs about $31 per megawatt hour to get energy from solar facilities on Idaho Power Service territory.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And for wind, it's about $50 per megawatt hour.
Okay.
For a gas plant, it's about $120.
Oh, wow. It's still way up.
It's still way up. If you're interested, a nuclear plant is about $236.
Wow.
So when you look at those numbers, I said the capitalistic engine is really moving.
Exactly.
It doesn't take a genius to say, should I get energy that costs $31 an hour, or should I get energy that costs $120 an hour?
Exactly an hour. Do we have an idea what percentage of electricity today is generated in the United States from renewables? And of course, a lot of people throw in hydroelectric with renewables, but let's talk about solar and wind. Do you have an idea how much we've transitioned from fossil fuels to wind and solar, and how do you see the trends in the near term?
My recollection is somewhere between 12 and 18% of the national U.S. electricity grid is coming from renewables. It is not enough. It is not enough. It is not enough. The rest of it is coming from we call them thermal plants, but those are gas and coal, and some biomass plants where we're burning wood and residuals.
Across the board of all types of generation.
Yeah, and this is the Pacific Northwest in particular. In the last year or two, they are now projecting somewhere between 5 and 7% growth. So for the last 20 years, utilities and public utility commissions have been quietly operating in the background. But when all of a sudden you see, 5, 6, 7% growth in the next few years, and this is happening for a number of reasons, the Inflation Reduction Act is making an incentive for companies to onshore manufacturing that used to be offshore.
Right.
That's creating a lot of additional electricity demand. We are electrifying everything from, your gas furnace that's now using electricity.
Right.
We're electrifying transportation, although in earnest, the electric vehicle transition is still very, very
Not
early
happening
days.
as quick as we had hoped.
Yes, but all of these things are happening and I should mention server farms and AI are really, really growing quickly. And those are big energy hogs. So all of these things are happening at the exact same time, which also happen to coincide with our need and desire to switch to renewable. So what is going to happen in the energy space in the Pacific Northwest, I know best, but this is happening across the United States in particular, that there is going to be a rapid increase in total electricity demand that is coinciding with a rapid build out of renewable. So a lot's going to change.
Cheaper.
Yes, and I should mention, most of our energy system was built in the 1930s through 70s, and they had 60-year timelines. So let's pretend climate change didn't exist. Let's pretend we weren't electrifying everything. Our infrastructure is just old enough that it needs to be replaced anyway.
Well, it's a wonderful perspective, and you have the opportunity of a many-year perspective to study these issues and look at international studies and reports that you thought were pessimistic not long ago, and now things are happening because of, I guess, basically the economy. It just affects on the economy and costs in China and here. And so you have a cautiously optimistic view of where we're going to be and where your children and how your children and grandchildren are going to live.
I have a very cautiously optimistic view because what happens in the next 10 years, if we sprint towards our renewable energy goals, then we will still have snow for me to ski on. If we start lagging behind, then we won't have a glacier national park to go visit because there won't be any more glaciers. So,
right.
What happens every single year in the next 10 years is incredibly important, and there will be a lot of changes happening. But I am hopeful that we have an opportunity to sprint.
Wonderful. Well, Mr. Gallo, I really appreciate the time you've spent. You've given us great insight into these issues. I've heard lots of things today that I didn't know before. And let's keep working towards those goals and have a wonderful life for your children and grandchildren. Thank you so much. Thanks for tuning in to the Climate Guru podcast. Stay inspired, stay informed, and keep taking action for our planet's future. Until next time, and remember, together we can make a difference.